Good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I help coordinate the webinars here for Hausman Johnson Insurance. Thank you so much for attending today. I'd love to welcome you to today's webinar, Doubling Down for the DoD, How Cybersecurity Requirements Impact Defense Contractors, presented by David Cruz and Larry Botker of Tetra Defense. This webinar is interactive and will feature a question and answer session. You can type a question in during the webinar and Larry will address it. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we're hoping you can fill out for us to give us feedback on the webinar and webinar topics you're interested in learning more about. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on the webinar archive section of our website. Each attendee will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. I would now like to introduce you to our speakers, David Cruz and Larry Botker. Larry Botker is the Director of Cyber Risk Management of Tetra Defense. He has made it his mission to reduce cyber risks by protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of IT systems and mission-critical sensitive data. Very important job, Larry.
Thank you.
Larry has decades of experience aligning businesses to effectively manage IT and security needs through projects like cyber risk assessments, vulnerability analysis, and penetration testing. Larry has managed to manage organization compliance across several different cybersecurity frameworks, has worked to develop and implement information security policies and procedures, as well as led cybersecurity awareness and training for teams across several industries. David Cruz is Director of Business Development for Tetra Defense. Cyber and privacy risk is the third line of David's career. As a banker, he helps his clients dispute fraudulent items on their credit report and recover from cases of account takeover. While working in insurance, he was dedicated to cyber insurance and tracked the rapidly evolving cyber risk landscape and insurance marketplace. At Tetra, his goal is to connect businesses with information security experts who can improve an organization's security posture and ability to respond to the latest cyber threats. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having us here today, Cassie. So thank you, everybody, for joining for today's session as well. It's a very timely topic, the CMMC, as we'll get into. This isn't one of those webinars that you just sign up for because you're casually interested in the topic. Usually with a topic like this, you likely have some sort of Department of Defense contract or some relationship with them already. And if you do, it's going to be very important that you understand how this cybersecurity requirement is going to affect your operations. So that's what we're going to get into today. Larry is going to be the brain on the operation here. I'm just the biz dev guy, so I'm good for a smile and a good bit of conversation, but Larry's bringing the heat. My role here, what I'm going to try and do is, if we get into aspects of this presentation that might be a bit too technical, I'm going to wave the yellow flag here and I'll stop and I'll explain that. So even if you don't have a technical background, I want you to know that you can expect to get a lot out of this presentation, and as we're going, if there is a certain term that's used or an idea that you want a little bit more explanation on, by all means, there's the question and the chat feature within GoToWebinar here. By all means, feel free to use those heavily. We'll take questions and address any issues that you might have as we are going throughout the presentation. We'll certainly leave time for questions at the end as well. But with that, Larry, take it away.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody, and I want to thank Cassie for moderating this, and I also want to thank Hausman Johnson Insurance for allowing us to talk today. What we're going to do here is I'm going to really give two fictional organizations to talk through the rest of this presentation. But before I do want to say the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, I'm very impressed with what has been done with it so far. And Katie Arrington is the Chief Information Security Officer for the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, which is a real, they need the acronym that. But her and her team has done a fantastic job of putting this all together. And I hope that you share the same passion that we have for what's going on with CMMC when you're through with this presentation. The other thing about it is we're going to be very high level, as David was saying. We're not going to get too technical. And we're going to give you our contact information. You can always reach out to us. We're, again, very passionate about what's going on with CMMC, and we'll talk about I only get 90 minutes or 30 minutes to talk about this today, but we could talk about it all day. So let's talk about how we got here, and we'll start with these two fictional organizations. So Wendy's windshield wipers. I just made it up. I hope there's no Wendy's windshield wipers out there, but Wendy's windshield wipers in this fictional story, they make awesome windshield wipers. And the thing about it is they also do contracts for a company called Mike's Military Machines. What do you think? Those are pretty good. I like alliteration. Larry likes alliteration. So the thing about Wendy's windshield wipers, when they manufacture those windshield wipers, they really don't care or don't need to know all about the Department of Defense workings. Mike's Military Machines, on the other hand, anything with a tire on it, Mike's Military Machines build it. They're one of the biggest contractors in the world, and they build Humvees, trucks, all the things that have with tires on it, they build for the military. That's two fictional organizations we're going to talk through. We're going to talk about their journey towards cybersecurity best practices for the rest of this presentation. So with that, how we got here. So when Mike's Military Machines, that's going to be hard to say. It's going to be a conflict there. When Mike's Military Machines contracts with Wendy's windshield wipers, before CMMC, both Wendy's windshield wipers and Mike's Military Machines had to use the same foundation for their controls, which was NIST 171. NIST 800-171 was basically 110 controls that organizations had to implement, and they both had to follow them. Even though Mike's Military Machines had access to DoD's computer systems, they know where those machines are. Everything about them was more information than Wendy's windshield wipers needed to have. So what NIST 800-171 is, it's a framework of cybersecurity controls, and National Institute of Standards and Technology, one of the best organizations you can go to if you go to their website. Again, we'll give you resources when we're done here. But if you go to their website, you can look at the 110 controls that you have to have in order to meet the Department of Defense contracts. With that, just to give you some examples, encryption is one of the controls. Passwords, anti-malware, all those things, intrusion detection, all those things, again, for Mike's Military Machines, Wendy's windshield wipers had to do as well. So that caused some challenges between the two. So when Mike enters into a contract with Wendy, our challenge was that Mike just cared about the windshield wipers. And so if Wendy had some issues where they could not do all 110 controls, they were able to build what is called plan of action and milestones to say, okay, we're going to work on these controls, but they're not implemented today. Plans of action and actions and milestones, or POMs as the industry calls it, those were what Wendy was allowed to do to continue to do her contract with Mike's Machines. With that, what would happen is there could go for years, and again, these are fictional organizations, but these are real stories. So Mike's Machines, when they're working with Wendy, they're saying, okay, don't worry about it. Just build us those windshield wipers. We'll deal with it later. And those POMs could go on for a long period of time before they're actually remediated. So that's one of the challenges that folks was having before CMMC. The other major challenge is Wendy's windshield wipers really didn't need to have all 110 of those controls. Okay? They only needed to do a few of them. We're going to get to that on later slides. The other important thing here was that Wendy and both Mike's could do self-assessments. There was no formality around who had to audit them or what they had to do to meet compliance. Now, there were some, I'll put a disclaimer here, there were some contracts that required auditors, but in this case, most of the Department of Defense contractors did not really require formal audits unless you were a prime contractor like Mike's Machines. So with that, there were a lot of folks self-assessing themselves and maybe not being accurate or making misstatements on what they were trying to do with their cybersecurity controls. And again, if you have any questions, please put them up here because I like interactiveness. Or David, if you want me to cover anything in more detail, I certainly will.
So far, so good.
Good, thanks. So what is the goals of CMMC? Why do they care? Well, going back to that story, they want to ensure that all the Department of Defense contractors are protecting the confidential and controlled unclassified information, CUI, you'll hear, or federal contract information. Again, I'll give that definition. But at the end of the day, the Department of Defense wants to ensure that the cybersecurity controls are in place to protect the United States assets and our allies. At the end of the day, that's really what they're trying to do. They want to, the other thing that they want to do here is they want to ensure that the controls that are being implemented, and actually I'm going to change controls to practices now. Practices are what they're calling it as far as the details go. At the end of the day, the way you implement your cybersecurity controls should be done the way you're handling the confidential control and classified information or the federal contract information. It really should be done the way you're handling the data. Wendy should not have to do the same thing that Mike is doing as far as cybersecurity controls. And I believe, and I think you will too, that the Department of Defense Acquisition Department has done a great job of defining what those levels are, which I'll get to when we get to it. What is the Cybersecurity Model Certification? Well, as we get into, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, as I talked about earlier, we're gonna really talk about the capabilities that we're trying to do here to get where you need to be with your cybersecurity. So maturity is, and again, I'll define it in a little bit. Maturity means that Wendy's maturity doesn't have to be the same level of maturity for the cybersecurity controls as Mike's does. The other important thing here, no matter what level you are, you're going to require a third-party assessor is going to have to assess you. A third-party assessor is going to have to assess you, and they call them CMMC third-party assessment organizations. And if you like acronyms, this is the formal acronym, C3PAO. So if you're a Star Wars fan, I don't know if they did it because it was a Star Wars fan thing, but C3PAO, and I'm trying to get them to do R2D2 somewhere in here, but we'll get to that later. But it's all levels will require a third-party assessor to assess the cybersecurity controls. Now, the other thing as we go to the upper right is this is an important distinction too for all Department of Defense contractors. Let's say Wendy gets ransomware. If Wendy gets oh my goodness, that's a tongue twister. If Wendy gets ransomware, that means Wendy cannot ship her windshield wipers to Mike's military machines. It's a butterfly effect. If Wendy can't ship her windshield wipers to Mike's machines can't ship the vehicles to the Department of Defense. So Mike's Machines also has maybe thousands and thousands of contractors. If any one of those contractors has a gap in their ability to ship materials or work with the Mike's Machines, if any one of them has a gap in their security controls and it causes ransomware or outages and they can't ship, Mike's Machines is also impacted, and so is the Department of Defense. That's a very important distinction here, because everybody in the supply chain is important for this process as you go up the chain. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think that's one piece that, if there's any one takeaway from this session here today, it's that if your organization is doing any sort of business with the DoD, CMMC will apply to you. It doesn't matter if you're selling Humvees, if you're selling F-16s, or if you're selling packets of applesauce. If you sell a product or service to the Department of Defense, this certification requirement is on your shoulders.
Yes, and all Department of Defense contractors in the supply chain have a vested interest in everybody else's capability to meet the cybersecurity controls.
Correct.
And the other thing here too is that as we get into the ability to demonstrate your cybersecurity controls, Mike's military machines may help out their contractors to do this. We're starting to see more and more of that where the bigger prime contractors that are closely aligned to DoD are helping some of the smaller contractors get there. Which leads us to two main things that we care about when we talk about CMMC. Federal contract information. If we go back to Wendy, they may have emails of the people they're working with. They may know about Mike's military machines as far as, their Humvees or trucks, but they certainly won't know the blueprints of those machines. They really just care about getting their windshields on the machine. They won't know the measurements of the vehicles or how wide the metal is. They won't know any of that information, but they may have contact information. They may have voicemails about it. They're not going to really, what they're really handling is federal contract information, or FCI. Wendy's windshield wipers, again, it's hard. Wait till I get to the last. They just care about the federal contract information, and that's all they have to worry about. Mike's Military Machines, on the other hand, is handling blueprints. As we said, they probably have strategic plans. They know where the vehicles are. They probably have access to personally identifiable information of military personnel. They may even have VPN access or access to Department of Defense computers, so they know where they have to go if they have to service these vehicles. They have a lot of controlled unclassified information, or CUI, that they need to be concerned about. Okay, those are the two terms that you're going to hear almost exclusively throughout. There's other acronyms, like I said. There's a lot of acronyms in government, but these two are the most important when we're talking about CMMC. When we get to how is CMMC structured, again, it may look complex or confusing when you look at when you download the CMMC version 1 that came out in January of 2020, and we'll get in the timelines here shortly. But what they've done is they've really broken it out into easier chunks to understand. So, for example, the domains, there's 17 of the domains, okay, like access control and asset management. So the domains are the high-level things you need to be doing. But then they're broken out into capabilities, so subsections of domains, okay? A narrower scope, maybe 4 items out of access control if you're a level 1, 4 items. But if you're a level 5, you're probably going to have about 16 capabilities that you have to deal with for access control. So access control would be the domain, and capabilities would be subcontrols under the domain.
Can you give us a couple other examples of what those capabilities would be?
Sure.
Access control is one. What are some other cybersecurity areas that CMMC?
Yes, great question. So I've been working on architecting some solutions for clients right now. So I'll talk about a level 2 organization.
Sure.
I haven't gotten to level 2, but I'll just give you one. A system security plan. When you get into level 2, I'm not going to give numbers. I don't remember the numbers off that half my head. A system security plan is part of risk management, I believe. Again, I would have to look at the documents again. My memory is not that great. We said I've been doing this for 30 years. Anyway, system security plan, level 2, which means at a level 2 organization, even though a level 2 organization is only handling FCI most likely, they still have to have a system security plan that defines all their controls. So the system security plan is the capability and a practice. Underneath that, then they have to demonstrate all of their controls. They have to document all of their controls within the system security plan. The system security plan is under risk management as the domain.
Okay.
That's one area. Access control is another domain. And underneath access control, like most folks, even level 1 has access control domain.
And access control is having the password, multi-factor authentication.
A level 2 will have multi-factor authentication. A level 1 would say, I just need to have a password and account. It needs to be a strong password and account. So that would be a practice, but underneath there would be a capability that states, hey, you have to do these 4 access control things underneath the access control domain.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Practices are where we get into the details. Practices are like ingredients. Capabilities are like the recipe, and domains are like the cake, if you want to kind of use that analogy. Now, that's one side of it. The next piece you need to know is processes. So all the domains, capability, and practices that you're doing, you have to do processes to show your maturity levels of doing that thing. So let's get back to the passwords. Your processes are, as you get higher up the levels, so with a level 1, I have to have a strong password and account. I have to protect my account and have a good password. At a level 2, I have to show processes that I have a policy around it, have a procedure around it, and I'm communicating it to the organization. So that's that level 2 saying, I have policies and documents around it. Level 1 won't need policies, although we're going to encourage folks at level 1 to have it. At a level 3 organization, we're saying, not only do we have to have strong passwords, but we have people dedicated to ensuring people are trained to have strong passwords, so there's a training program. There might be a CISO at a level 3, a Chief Information Security Officer, that says, here are the ways we're going to help people understand what strong passwords means. That's on the maturity level, that's considered managed.
Sure.
Then what you may do is you may evaluate passwords. How good are they? You might use a tool like John the Password Cracker. Again, we have cool names in this world, but you might use a tool that evaluate all your passwords to see if they're strong or not. If you're doing that, that means you're reviewing your controls. You're at a level 4. You're reviewing. Then you're going to communicate all your password practices to the board, leadership. You're going to manage it. You're going to monitor it for over time. and you're going to show leadership that you're doing the right thing, and maybe you'll have automation involved to make it stronger, then you're optimized at level 5.
Okay.
So as you go up in the maturity level, you're getting stronger controls and more going to optimize as you get up the top of the chain.
And the basic idea here from the level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is that, you know, if you make windshield wipers, you're likely going to be, level 1 is all they're going to require of you because your risk is relatively low. A level 5 might be somebody like Amazon Web Service or Google, somebody that's providing very intimate access to Department of Defense data and systems. Obviously, your cybersecurity risk goes way up if you're that type of organization. If you make windshield wipers, you still have a risk, but the program looks like it's tailored to put the right amount of requirements on the right size and sophistication of businesses.
100% correct. As a matter of fact, this next slide really covers that well. Great segue. So much like we rehearsed this. So if you look at level 1, as we talked about, 17 practices are required for level 1. And that's really considered basic cyber hygiene. And quite frankly, even if you're an individual, almost all of us on this webinar probably have strong passwords when we do banking.
Okay.
We probably have anti-malware patching at home on our home systems. That's basic cyber best practices. And you're probably physical security controls. You lock your doors. That's all level 1 has to do with some basic things. They don't even have to document. Again, we're going to encourage folks to document, but they don't have to. They just have to show that they're doing those 17 things.
Yeah.
As you go up the ladder here, I'm not going to go over each one, but as you get to a level 5, like Mike's what did I call him? Mike's
military machines.
Oh, you memorized it.
Oh,
all right,
yeah.
good job. Mike's military machines are probably going to have 171 practices of what they're doing. And everybody in between. Now remember, Mike's Machines has 20,000 vendors. So if you have like Randy's restaurant, I planned that, by the way. If a Randy's restaurant is in Mike's building, providing sandwiches to the personnel, Randy's restaurant might be a level 2 because they're a higher risk than Wendy's windshield.
Because
they're physically there.
Yeah.
They have the capability maybe to walk around the facility. They may have the capability to connect to computer systems as they're in the organization. So they're a little bit higher risk. But again, Randy's restaurant really shouldn't be handling FCI or CUI.
Yeah.
So they're going to probably be a level 2 if they're a restaurant in Mike's building.
Sure.
As Mike gets other subcontractors like, you know, wheel manufacturers or Larry's Lug Nuts or whatever, Lori's Labels. I'm just going to go all down. Should I just go all down?
Cool.
Are we losing people? So as you get higher up the chain of the supply chain, there's going to be level 3s most likely. Then that reminds me, if you entered into contracts up to this point with the DoD, or you're a subcontractor of a DoD contractor, and you committed to NIST 171, like we talked about earlier, those 110 controls, you've probably been preparing for CMC for quite a while then. Because you've already committed to it. Yeah, you already committed to it. If you are at NIST 171 when you're in the contract today, most likely then you're handling CUI. So most likely you'll be at a level 3, 130 practices that you'll have to be doing for the auditor. And as we already talked about the maturity level on the right side here, that's just a graphic representation of maturity level 1 through 5, as I already talked about, performed all the way up to optimizing. If you're a level 5, your automation of your controls is going to be critical to you, so you can be more efficient with what you're doing and more effective with what you're doing, and really lower your cost if you're automating your processes. And that really correlates to optimizing when you talk about a capability. By the way, they didn't just pull a capability maturity model out of the air. Capability maturity model has been around for a long time. If you're a software developer, you've probably been using capability maturity models when you develop your software because they followed pretty much the same terminology except for at level 4. In this capability maturity model, on most of them, it's considered quantitatively managed at level 4. They changed it to review because that's really more what you're doing here. What they want to see is reviewed than quantitatively managed, which could get kind of complex when you start putting measurements in there. And then at the end of the day, the practices and processes pretty much align up. When you talk about a level 1 basic cyber hygiene, you're also looking at perform. So when these windshield wipers are performing things that they're showing due diligence on performing those things, as you go up the ladder on your practices side, you're really aligning to what you're trying to do with your processes as well. So they've done a really good job of aligning the two to get to what we said earlier as the goal, which is protecting CUI and FCI and everything related to that.
So they're really looking at not only what you're doing, they're also looking at how well you're actually doing them. So you have these sort of parallel tracks that they're going to be asking about.
Exactly, parallel tracks. So as we stated earlier, there are some common traits that those levels will share. And I want to reiterate this because this is going to be important. You will need a third-party assessor no matter what level. You no longer can self-assess. That's critical here. And I think now's a good time. They're still working. So this whole process started about almost a year ago, August of 2019. January 2020, the CMMC version 1 was released. I'm stealing the thunder on the next slide, but I just want to make this point. The third-party assessor process is still in process of it's the CMMC Accreditation Board, CMMC-AB, if you like acronyms, is still putting together the plan for how these assessors are going to do the assessments, and they're getting training, all these kind of things. It's still in flight, still being developed, but when this goes into formal processes here, third-party assessors will be required no matter what level you are. Okay, that's the first important thing. As we talked about earlier, you no longer can have plans of action and milestones in order to get the contract.
So to put an example on that, if in a prior DoD contract you said, we don't have great access controls, but here's our plan of action to how we're going to get great access controls, the DoD would have accepted that and said, okay, well, as long as you're going to be working on it, that'll be good enough for us. That paradigm shift is now you have to have it up to snuff according to this level. You can't just write as an IOU for your security. You actually have to pay up for the contract.
I like that, IOU for your security.
There you go.
Exactly, and that is critical because again, what we've been seeing in the industry is those POEMs. You could have a dozen POEMs, but multi-factor authentication or encryption. If you're a small organization, it may cost too much to do those kind of things.
Well, you think about level 1. Level 1 only has 17 requirements.
Yeah.
So if you have a dozen IOUs, then most of your security program doesn't exist yet.
Especially if you start off with NIST 171, 110 controls, it would be challenging. Even an SSP, a system security plan, that takes months to write for most organizations, no matter how small they are. No longer can do that under CMMC. Plan of action and milestones go out the window. Okay, which leads us to the third thing is, again, as you're in those levels, you're not going to have as many POEMs like David you were saying, because you're really not handling CUI anymore, and you're going to be at a level 1 or a level 2. So you're at a level 2, you're going to have a few things you're going to have to do, but a level 1, you're going to have 17 things you should be doing anyway without CMMC. Which leads us to the cost. I think the main thing we're concerned about here is cost, as we alluded to or intimated. Here's the nice thing about this. The contracts we've seen up until this point, some contracts were allowing cost of audits and cost of controls in the contracts themselves. You could be negotiating between the prime contractor and the subcontractor. If you're going to have cybersecurity controls, sure, you can charge it back. Under the CMMC, the audits, for now, if you go to their site, they're saying the cost of the audits are going to be a part of the contract. So you can get, when you do the CMMC auditor, the auditor comes to do your audit, you can charge that back. Now, if you have, again, you can't have remediation. If you're going to audit it, it's got to be clean. So the thing that's still kind of out there in the gray area is the cost of improvements to get the contract. The cost of improvements should not, the logic behind this is if you're getting a third-party auditor coming to your door, you have to be already compliant before the audit's happening. If you're not, you got to remediate before you can go after the contractor, before you get the contract. Again, that's where it's unclear if those costs are going to be allowable or not. The most important thing here is if you are not certified, you will not be able to go after the contract. You will not win the contract. You no longer will be able to participate in the RFIs or RFPs. Contracts. You can still participate, but again, that's a gray area.
Yeah, so it's important to note sort of where this requirement lives in terms of the process for DoD contracts. So in the actual request for proposal that businesses and contractors would be responding to, it's section L or section M of that document. It's going to be added to say that this contract is going to require at least level 2 certification for CMMC. So you need to go out and get a third-party assessor to assess you to make sure you're at least at level 2. So that's where the requirement's going to live. The requirement doesn't live in the contract itself. The contract assumes you've gotten through the RFP process, and the RFP contains this requirement. So if you can't prove that you've at least met whatever level is required in the RFP, you just will not be allowed to continue in the RFP process. So.
Perfect. Yeah, that's definitely more clear. So that's perfect. So let's talk about the timeline then. That leads us to a nice transition here. There's the timeline. As we stated, January 31st, it came out the CMMC version 1, which we read diligently. Again, that came out in this year. Here's the nice thing for organizations with June 2020. There's a lot of conscious thought about how the DoD is rolling this out. So you're not going to have to do all this right away. For June of 2020, there's going to be 10 RFIs out that contractors will be able to request for information. Those will go out. Contractors will be able to participate in this pathway program, and they'll be testing it out really to determine which contractors respond with RFIs, what do they look like, how do we get the levels assigned, and all those kind of things. That's going to happen by June of 2020, where there's going to be 10 RFIs out that will require CMMC version 1. You will have to meet CMMC version 1 to respond to the contracts. Those are going out to the various levels that the DoD believes should be in those levels. That's in June of 2020. Usually with an RFI, then the follow-up is our request for a proposal. There's also going to be 10 of those that should happen in October of 2020. So, and when I say contracts, it's important to state that 10 contracts doesn't mean 10 subcontractors. 10 contracts could have 150 contractors associated with the contract. So again, we're looking at a fairly good set of organizations that are going to be participating in that, which should give a bellwether indicator for all the thousands and thousands of actual DoD contractors that are out there as we get into the end of the year.
So a good example there is if the DoD is putting out a request for a proposal, and one of those contracts is for 15,000, or maybe call it 1,000 Humvees. You think about all of the subcontractors that go into building a Humvee, the lug nut manufacturer, the people that make the tires, the people that make the windshield wipers, that make the radio systems. Every one of those, every part in that vehicle, if it's made by a different subcontractor, that requirement is going to fall down onto those subcontractors, even if you make the lug nuts and floor mats.
Larry's lug nuts.
Larry's lug nuts.
Frank's floor mats. Sorry. Again, you told me to stop. Okay. All right.
Just turning to
All right. So with that, after October 2020, we've done this pilot program, pathway program, I believe it's called. Then what we get into is 2021 and beyond. This is where it's going to be very important for folks to understand that 2026 may sound like a long ways away, but if you, again, have open POEMs or you've gotten assessed and you know you got some work to do, that may not be that far away because you have, roadmaps and strategic plans and budgets that you're going to be creating to get your controls in place where they need to be, your practices where they need to be. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is, maybe try to figure out what level you're going to be at. Like I said, if you're already signing contracts with NIST 171, I can tell you with pretty good confidence you're going to be at a level 3. So you're going to have those 130 controls you're going to want to have in place and before 2026. And here's the other thing that's important about that timeline. That timeline is if there's RFIs and RFPs out there in that timeline, and you are competing with another contractor for that contract, the DoD and that contractor will give higher preference to the one that's already CMMC certified. So it's a marketing, it's a competitive advantage to be CMMC certified before the 2026, obviously, but more importantly, to keep and maintain the contracts that you already have or the ones you know you're going after. You're going to want to do some readiness assessments, fix your gaps, and then have the formal audit conducted within that time frame.
We did have one question come in through the question function here. Larry, the question is asked, are the certifications required per each individual contract, or is the certification an annual certification process?
That's a great question. So I'll start with each individual contractor, the certification is to the contractor. So if you're a contractor, you got to get certified to answer that part of the question. The time, they have not, on their frequently asked questions for the DoD, the CMMC webpage, they have not indicated how often you're going to have to do your CMMC certification.
Okay.
Our theory, based on what we've been seeing, is it's going to be an annual thing. That's only a theory.
Yeah.
It's not confirmed yet, and it's still open-ended on the DoD website or the CMMC website.
Okay. That'll be something that with the changes that continue to go on with the CMMC framework, if you hop on our LinkedIn page and follow that, we're going to be posting regular updates there for the next years, probably.
Until 2026.
At least 2026. So if you follow us on there, you'll see those regular updates come out pretty regularly.
Perfect. Thank you, David.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the current. So what do you do? Where do you start? What kind of questions would you have? So some of the things we're running into with some clients is not sure if they're currently in contracts or not. You could have turnover, you could have people starting new that haven't been with your organization in a while, and maybe you're not sure if you're a DoD contractor. So we gave you the link here where you can go to this website, Government Contracts One, and you can look up you can query your organization to see if you got current contracts. And if you do, you can see what you've sold to your prime contractor or the Department of Defense, and you can get an idea of what your contracts are worth today. Okay, so that's the first thing is, are you a contractor or not? If you're not sure, you can go to that website. As I've already intimated, if you are already in contracts and you've already committed to NIST 171, then you probably got to now get rid of those poems and start working towards where you need to be. Okay. Then one of the other questions you got to ask yourself, and we're talking to clients seems like every day about this, is how comfortable are you with CMMC? That's where you can go to the websites. We're going to give resources. Go to our website. Many people are talking about this because, as I stated, it's a big deal, mostly because, again, for the goals that we've already talked about in this presentation. But your goal is to get comfortable with CMMC. That's one of the reasons we're doing this webinar. We have workshops coming up, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But you really want to get comfortable with it because I can tell you when you look at them, it's not, I don't want to make it sound like it's not easy, but it's really pretty straightforward of what you got to do at each level. And you just got to get comfortable at the level you are perceived that you're going to be at. What are some of the challenges? We already talked a little bit about them, is how ready are you? The other thing is you got to ask yourselves as you have some open poems that you may have, like intrusion detection, or one of the level 4 is you got to segment your network. Okay, segmenting a network, for example, is not an easy task.
That's how you do it over the weekend.
You can't just plug and play your, hey, here. When I say segmentation, I mean those systems that process, transmit, or store CUI data, controlled unclassified information. Those systems that do that, you really don't want to commingle with Randy's Restaurant or all the other, accounting systems. You want to put them in their own network so you can reduce the scope of the footprint of the attacker, but you want to reduce the scope of the footprint. You want to have your controls really focused on those systems that handle the CUI. You're going to segment those out. But we've been a part of network segmentation projects, and that can be a challenging thing. What needs to talk to what? What does the design look like? All those kind of things you have to be thinking about if you're talking about network segmentation. I've been a part of projects with network segmentation that took 18 months to make sure. In large organizations, it could take that long, or even longer. That's one of those one practice item that you would have to do if you're at a level 4 or level 5. Okay, so that's one example of an open poem that may be out there. Another open poem is multi-factor authentication. A lot of folks may have waited on that. You no longer can do that. You got to have MFA. So those are two good examples of poems that might be out there that we've seen with other organizations. So that also goes with what kind of investments do you need to make? Where do you get started? How many open poems out there? What priorities should I make for them? All right, Kathy's given us the timeline here. So I think we're just, the nice thing is we're really just turning it out here. Your next steps is, again, as we talked about, you're going to have to kind of come to an understanding where your levels may be. It's important to note here, they're still working through what levels there are, but some indicators are out there what level you're going to be. I've already talked about. but you know, as you go to the website or you go to you watch what's going on, your levels will start to be more clear as we go through as the third-party auditors are getting trained and going through the process. We already talked about it. Do a readiness assessment. The one thing, if I can say this, if you're going to be preparing, get your documentation done. Do it today. Documentation is going to be a big deal. As you get into level 2, documentation, there's a lot of practices about documentation, your policies, your procedures, how you handle incidents. All that's in your documentation. If there's one thing you should be doing today is aligning your documentation to the CMMC as quickly as you can. Again, just by doing it as part of the best practices. Then, after you've done your documentation, then you need to ask yourself, do our practices align with what's in documentation? Are we doing what we say in documentation? And if you're truly not, then you need to start remediating those items as well. All right, David?
Yeah.
I'm turning it over to you at exactly the right time.
No, that is wow, impressed, Larry. What's good to remember about CMMC is that don't think that you're doing this just to make the DoD happy. Your organization is going to benefit too from having a good information security program in place, because attacks like a ransomware attack or a data breach or a social engineering fraud scheme, those besides having a downstream effect on the Department of Defense and the war fighters in that area, it's going to have an immediate impact on your company as well. So it's important to think of this as you're investing in yourself, and by investing in yourself, you're gaining the ability to win DoD contracts. So it's just about having a good risk management program in place for your organization as well. For companies that might not even be approaching a DoD contract, I still think it would be appropriate to look at CMMC as a possible tool, a possible framework around which to build an information security program. So we'd be remiss if we didn't mention a little bit on the topic of cyber insurance here as well. That is a critical cog in the wheel of any cyber risk management program. And we're going to talk a little bit, just do a 10,000-foot overview of what that is and how that works into your overall business's cyber risk management, and see where we might have some overlap with CMMC as well, because there is going to be some overlap. So really, when we look at cyber insurance, there's two buckets of coverage that we're going to be looking at. The first is your first-party coverage, and that is just losses that your organization incurs as a result of a covered loss. And covered losses are going to be that first line, hacking, data corruption and theft, ransomware, et cetera, et cetera. The second bucket of coverage is going to be your third-party losses, and that's liability for damages and defense costs arising from harm that you cause to others. So if you fail to protect someone's private information, if you fail to prevent a transfer of malicious code from your network to someone else's, those are potential instances where you might be found liable, and you would want insurance coverage to help protect against those liability lawsuits. And then finally, regulatory investigations and fines and penalties that might arise from them. There's not going to be a regulatory fine for not being CMMC compliant. The fine, in quotes, is that you just won't get the contract. That's your fine. But for other areas of information security, like HIPAA, for example, they're well known for handing down pretty hefty fines. Graham Leach Bliley in the financial sector, states attorneys general can levy fines as well. So the third-party liability piece of the policy will cover that. Perfect. So it's important to know a little bit about how a cyber claim is actually handled, because it's a little different than, say, property insurance or general liability, for example. In an instance like that, we'll take property insurance. If you have a fire that destroys a part of your building, typically what happens there is you're going to call a fire and water restoration company. They're going to come and do the restoration, and then a contractor will come in and help build out the space to get you back to where you were in the first place. And really what you're going to do there is just submit invoices to your insurance company. The insurance company is going to pay them, and everybody goes on with their happy, carefree lifestyles. Cyber claims are a little different, though, because the carrier is very intimately involved in helping you respond to that breach or that network attack. So we'll go through a little bit of the life cycle of how a cyber claim gets handled here. So The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to, once you discover that breach, you're going to report that incident to your insurance carrier. After that, there's two things that are going to happen simultaneously. The carrier is going to undergo an evaluation of the breach where they're going to get a legal attorney, as opposed to all those non-legal attorneys. You're going to get an attorney involved to help review your legal obligations, and then that attorney is going to engage a forensics investigator to figure out what happened, how it happened, how we can kick the hacker out, and how we can make sure they don't come back in. Then the immediate short-term consequences are also going to be handled by the carrier. They're going to engage notification and credit monitoring firms if you have a legal requirement to notify people. If you suffer data recovery losses or business interruption losses because your actual data is corrupted and unusable for a short amount of time, those losses would be paid. And then if you need to bring in a public relations professional to field questions from the media, from customers, from regulators, the PR professional is provided as well. And then lastly, long-term consequences. So class action lawsuits, regulatory fines, penalties, reputational harm, and then future income loss as well. Each one of those is going to be addressed by the policy, and the resources necessary to help you address them are going to be provided as well. So where this overlaps with CMMC is in the risk management offerings that carriers typically include with cyber policies. This may come as a shock, but the carrier doesn't want to pay a claim. They would rather see you not have a claim in the first place. So they want to help you limit your risk, which, I mean, that's a win-win for everybody. You don't suffer a cyber attack, and they don't pay a claim. Really, everybody's happy here. They will pay a claim if you actually have a covered loss, but they would rather avoid that in the first place. So my recommendation would be to ask your agent what cyber risk management offerings your insurance carrier is offering within the policy. Perfect. So one example that I'll give is Chubb Insurance Company. They're one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, and they do quite a bit in the cyber insurance space. So they offer a couple of things on a complimentary basis to their policyholders, and then they do some heavily discounted pricing for some other services as well. So one of the domains that Larry was talking about in CMMC was access control. Chubb Insurance will give you a password manager that allows you to create very complex passwords and have those passwords encrypted and have them live within your network. That's just a free service that they're offering to you just by being a Chubb insured. Online cybersecurity education. I'm sure security training and awareness is one of these domains. Sure. They give you a platform for employee training. So that's just something they give just by being a virtue of a Chubb customer. And most insurance companies are going to have something like this. It might be a slightly different flavor, it might be a slightly different service, but these services are going to be provided along with your policy to help you manage your cyber risk. In Chubb's instance, the discounted services, these are things you might actually have to pay a little bit for, but incident response plan testing, phishing simulations, vulnerability scans, security benchmarking, and vendor risk monitoring. Those are all services that they include at a discounted rate. So as you look at approaching a CMMC certification requirement, it's worth asking, does my insurance company offer me any complimentary or discounted services that will help me hit that requirement with as little capital output as possible? All right, so the last thing we're going to touch on are two slides of what you want to look for in cyber insurance policy and maybe some things that you want to avoid in a cyber insurance policy as well. So a couple of things that you want to look for. You want to make sure you're having the lowest business interruption waiting period as possible. When I said to peel back the curtain a little bit, I worked at Houseman for about 5.5 years as the director of Houseman Johnson's cyber practice. I left the company in November, and my office is one floor below Houseman Johnson's, and I see them every day. So I didn't really leave. I just moved to a different company here, but I see Houseman every day. So back when I was with Houseman doing cyber insurance specifically, it was very common to see business interruption periods, say 4 or 5 years ago, at 24 hours or 48 hours. At this point, that's really unacceptable because the moment you have a ransomware attack that hits, you don't want to have to wait 24 hours to get a incident response team in place to help you recover. You need boots on the ground as soon as possible. And boots on the ground could be physical in some cases. A lot of this disaster recovery work can be done remotely as well. So don't take boots on the ground too literally. Another thing that you want to look at is having a policy that has a system failure coverage trigger, not just a security failure coverage trigger. Now, where that comes into play is if the security failure coverage trigger is, again, an outmoded or an older style of coverage that says this policy will not be triggered or pay any claims unless you have a breach of your cybersecurity. Well, okay, well, that's good. You certainly want that at least. But coverage over the past year or two has been broadened to include system failure coverage. So what that basically means is if you have your head of IT and they're doing a system update, not for a security issue, but they're updating maybe to a newer version of Windows, for example, and that update just really goes poorly, and your systems are shut down for 8, 12, 24 hours because this update just went so badly. If you can actually prove that you had a loss of business income or you incurred extra expenses that you otherwise would not have had to incur, if you have system failure coverage, all those losses are going to be covered as well. So human error is included. It doesn't have to just be a security failure. The last thing we'll kind of hit at here, have coverage that's written on a pay on behalf of basis instead of reimbursement. Pay on behalf of means that you just submit invoices to the carrier and they pay them. A reimbursement basis means that you have to pay all these invoices as they come in and then ask the carrier to reimburse you. So it just helps with cash flow to have it on a pay on behalf of basis. Dependent business interruption is very important as well. Most businesses these days are using, say, Microsoft Office 365. They're using Amazon Web Services or the Google Cloud or some kind of cloud hosting. You want to make sure that if that business, if Amazon gets subject to a cyber attack or Microsoft or whoever is doing your cloud hosting, if they're the victim of an attack and you can't access your business files because they're in the cloud and the cloud is down, if you have a business interruption loss, you want to make sure that that's covered as well. Most forms are starting to include that, but it's not a given yet, so it's a good thing to look for. And then lastly, reputational harm. Business income losses are going to be insured on a cyber policy as long as it takes for you to recover from the attack. But once you're recovered from the attack, if you're still seeing losses of income as the weeks and months drag on, you want to make sure that those losses can be covered as well. An example I'll give is, say you've got a McDonald's and a Dunkin' Donuts right next to each other, and McDonald's has a really broadly publicized, really nasty cyber attack. You might have their customers that are going next door to Dunkin' Donuts for the next 6 months because they just don't feel quite comfortable getting their McChickens at McDonald's anymore. They want the Dunkin' Donuts instead. So the reputational harm coverage includes that future loss of income until your customers start coming back to your business. And lastly, some things you want to watch out for. Make sure that you have cyber coverage that's provided via a that line should be exactly reversed. You want to have coverage provided by a standalone policy, not by an endorsement. That mistake is mine. I wrote 10 pages. The standalone policy is far preferable because you're going to get broader coverage at a more competitive rate. If you have a cyber endorsement where they just add a rider to your property or to your liability policies, the scope of those coverages is typically limited and you're paying more per dollar of coverage than you would if you had a standalone policy. Finally, some harmful conditions that exist within some cyber policies, due diligence conditions that require you to make sure that you have the best security practices available, vendor security verification, that you're verifying that all your vendors have solid information security. Both of those things sound good, but in practice can be very hard to prove. So you want to make sure that those conditions aren't in your policy. And then as the social engineering callback provision, that has to do with social engineering fraud, where you get an email from somebody pretending to be the boss, and the boss says, I need you to wire me $50,000 so I can close this deal. If you have this callback provision in your policy, you actually have to pick up the phone and call your boss and verify that wire transfer. If you fail to do that, coverage would be denied. So you want to make sure that those conditions aren't in the policy here. Perfect. So if you have questions or you would like to learn more about that, by all means, we've got our blog up at the top there. My email and Larry's email are included there as well. We've been taking lots of calls and lots of meetings with companies in the area and across the region, specifically related to CMMC. It's a mutual sharing of information where we provide you with everything that we know and we answer questions that you've got, and we're certainly happy to do that with any of you. And then as it relates to cyber insurance needs, if you check out that email at the bottom, hjinfo@houseman-johnson.com. If you have questions about cyber insurance, send an email to that inbox there, and it will be routed to the appropriate party, and your question will be addressed that way. So we did have a couple of questions come through in the chat feature here. So one of the questions is we use Office 365. Are any of the tools that I'll need for CMMC available within that program?
That's a perfect question. Yes, Office 365 has some great things you can do to meet compliance. I'll give you a couple examples. Encryption. You can encrypt your emails through Office 365. You can have multi-factor authentication. So when you log into your email, you can use something that you receive. We have it here, where we receive a notification that somebody's logging in as you. Here you go, you press the button, you log in. So multi-factor authentication, encryption, you can even go as far as data loss prevention modules within Office 365. So those are three that I can think of with Office 365. And the beauty of it is there are a lot of documents you can use to configure it securely. Out of the box, I would say you have to still configure it the way you need it to be. So don't just think it's by default. You still have to go through the process.
Just because you have 365 doesn't mean you're secure. There are features you have to actually turn on and buttons you have to click to make that security happen. But the features are all built within there, and you might already be paying for them. So you don't have to go out and find a separate tool. You can just click some buttons within something you're already paying for.
That's a great point too. Is one of the best things you can do is try to use the tools that you have to meet compliance versus going out and investing if you don't have to.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've been helping clients do is, here's your controls, here's what you got. You got a firewall, you got Active Directory. Let's utilize Active Directory root policy objects to get those controls in place. So use what you have, then start investing if you need to.
Perfect. One more question came in, and it does relate to how you spend money on this. We've got, if you just answer this one as quick as you can here, is the DoD requiring that you spend a certain percentage of your revenue on InfoSec spending? How does a business determine how much is an appropriate amount of money to spend on cybersecurity?
DoD is so. First thing is DoD is not requiring any money spent if you don't need to. So they're not saying you have to have a certain amount of money.
Okay.
Reasonable is the term here. Reasonable controls and the CMMC documents that you can get, and NIST and those kind of documents, they will guide you on what you can do at reasonable cost. Because the other thing is, you don't want to go out of business because of this, because you're important to the supply chain.
Yeah.
So reasonable cost.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Larry.
So we got 1 minute to go. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Cassie. If you have any last comments you want to make. Again, thank you for having us here today.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh, one other thing.
Yeah.
We gave reference slides. So we did some slides at the end of this, and maybe if you want to just kind of go down. We didn't go everything we talked about. Some of these are reference slides that we pulled from CMC to help you out there. So those are available to you when you download the PowerPoint slides as well. Okay, back to you, Cassie.
Very nice. Yes, we want to make sure you guys know you're getting those reference slides. We want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. On this slide, we've got a couple of our cybersecurity workshops that we partnered with Tetra Defense on. So if this is something that, this webinar was very high level, but you would like a much more deep dive into the specifics of how this affects your business, I would really encourage you to sign up for these cybersecurity seminars. They are free. We are having them on March 19th and March 25th. The information is up there. If you would like to register, you can just go to Hausman Johnson's website and click on our upcoming events. We would love to see you there. And for more information, you can visit our website for any upcoming events. Reminder just to fill out that short survey. We'd love to hear what you thought of Larry and David talking today about their awesome doubling down on the DoD. Our next webinar is coming up in March, and we hope we can see you for that as well. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your morning.